I mean, it's an incredible operation, whatever you feel sort of morally or ethically about it. They obviously got into the supply chain of the pages and switched them out and knew when and where they were going to be distributed and put in this technology that allowed them all to explode at the same time. I mean, it's an extraordinary act of imagination within the Mossad to sort of come up with that, and then to pull it off without being discovered was remarkable. So from the intelligence community, it's a round of applause, you know. But whether the end game of it, the end is going to prove to justify the means, we shall see.
First of all, how are you finding Cheltenham? I mean, you did a really interesting event this morning with Ben McIntyre. You've got one this afternoon with Frank Gardner, who's the BBC security correspondent turned thriller writer himself. Yep. Is this your first time at the festival?
No, I've been here 3-4 times. The last time I was here, I interviewed the retired head of GCHQ, obviously the
a lot of local interest in that, I imagine.
And we were in a signing queue afterwards, and no fewer than 3 people came up to him with their mobile phones with messages on them for him. So they didn't want to speak out loud, and they just showed him the phone. He's like, "Oh yes, I remember." And then they had a kind of whole thing. And then other people had written messages to him that they passed him so he'd read, and that he would know who they were, or that they were related to somebody who worked at the donut. You know, it was fascinating. No, I love coming here. It's a very prestigious, always really interesting people in the green room. And yeah, I did an event with Ben and with Ava Glass this morning, which seemed to go quite well.
It's a really interesting point, actually, given how close we are to GCHQ. Does that help you shift books in this part of the world? Are they interested in that, or do they want to kind of get away from it all and read something different?
Well, you always feel 2 things. You feel there's a Times journalist in the crowd who's going to write. They wrote up a story when I interviewed the GCHQ guy, and you also feel that there are people who work there in the audience. And as I said, Ben McIntyre felt the same way. Ava's felt the same way. We knew sort of they were out there and kept kind of referencing them. But no, I signed a lot of books this morning, so somebody's buying them. Yeah, I don't know whether they're people who work there or just the locals are keen for spy thrillers for Box 88. But it's great.
Let's talk about one of the books that you're here to promote, which is Kennedy 35. Just without giving too much away, give us a little overview of what happens in this one.
So it's the third part in what's planned to be a sort of sequence of about 7 or 8 novels about a spy called Lachlan Kite, who works for Box 88, which is an Anglo-American intelligence service which sort of operates below the radar, kind of not much particular sort of political oversight. And in this third novel, in Kennedy 35, he is the sort of USP of the series is that you see him as a young spy from 1989 up to 9/11, and then you see him in the present day running Box 88 in London. And in this one, he's 23 and is sent to Senegal to try to watch initially, and then to grab a war criminal from the Rwandan genocide of '94. And he goes there under sort of backpacking cover with his girlfriend Martha, and things go quite badly wrong.
It's interesting you mentioned the Rwandan genocide. I mean, I wonder to what extent you seize on real life events for inspiration. I mean, is that something that you've always tried to do?
I have, and you have to be careful because you can get caught out by real life events. I remember when I was writing a book called The Spanish Game. I was living in Madrid. It was a novel about ETA. And the Atocha bombings happened sort of while I was at my desk. You know, you're probably too young to remember this, but it was, I think, 2005. And if those bombs had been planted by ETA, my book would have been in great difficulty. But as everybody knows, it was an Al-Qaeda attack. And actually, the sequel to Kennedy 35 is called Icarus 17, and it was going to be an Israeli-Lebanese story. But for obvious reasons, I have pressed pause on that, and it's now set in Greece and the Balkans. But the Box 88 series it takes real life events of the fall of the Berlin Wall or the Lockerbie plane crash of '88 and the Rwandan genocide and the fall of the Soviet Union, and then puts young Kite into those the aftermath of those historical incidents without being particularly kind of close to them. If you see what I mean.
It's interesting though. You mention Israel and Lebanon and what's happening at the moment. I mean, are you always wary of having stories set around events that feel too close to home?
Yeah, a little bit, and just because you just don't know what's going to happen in real life. And I mean, a very obvious example would be an assassination of an American president or an American presidential candidate. With everything that's gone on, but even before that, you're a slight hostage to fortune. Should something like that take place? So But I think if you're trying to do sort of realistic political spy thrillers, as I am, then it's more of a worry than if you're just doing a kind of more like a Ludlum-esque or an Ian Fleming type political thriller where you're just it's a totally kind of it's a different world, a different universe that you're inhabiting.
But it was interesting, even with you mentioned Fleming. It was interesting how when they made them into the films, the Bond producers tried to kind of tone down some of the geopolitics because they thought, one day the Cold War will come to an end, and we want these films to be watched all over the world. So there's probably a commercial incentive to do that as well.
Sure, and I think also this is a generalisation, but most audiences in the cinema, they're not particularly kind of political animals. And I've learned from this is like my 13th novel now, that really what people read these books for is the characters and the relationships and the sort of psychological side of the spy trade, as opposed to what I may or may not have to say about China or anything like that. But that hasn't sort of stopped me. But I know that it's not the juice that's really getting people to keep picking the books up. You
mentioned it's just the latest of the Lachlan Kite series. Do you know his progression? Do you know where he's going to end up? Do you map that far ahead?
Yeah, I haven't written it down, but it is all in my head. I know. And more actually of the sort of the grey area in his CV, as it were, is being filled in Icarus, which I'm writing now. I don't know the absolute specifics of every single story and how many novels there will be. It feels like about 7 at the moment, but it will end with a 9/11 book, with an Al Qaeda book. That's the idea.
And when you're fleshing out a character like Lachlan Kite, do you have you worked out tiny obscure details about his life that may never end up in a book, but that inform you as to kind of how he got to where he is?
I'm not conscious of doing that, but I'm sure I have those things in the back of my mind. Yes, like I have an idea of what he looks like, but I don't think I ever really describe him in any detail. I have of his size, his physicality, his voice, and so forth. But I don't necessarily put that down on paper. I don't quite know why I've always resisted describing him. I described Martha, but his girlfriend back in the 90s. But Kite is, I think the reader fills in a lot of those blanks.
What was your inspiration to become a spy thriller writer as opposed to writing a different type of fiction?
I was tapped on the shoulder, as they say, back in the 90s, around about 1995. A family friend put me up for an interview with MI6, and I didn't get in, but I had enough of an exposure to that world. And I had enough of an ambition to be a writer, because that was always a thing that I could do, to sort of marry the two and think, well, this is just crying out to be dramatised. So my first novel, Spy by Nature, was inspired by, in fact, kind of largely the first third of that book is just based on what happened to me, and then the rest is just a fiction about industrial espionage and the oil business. But it was a pure piece of good fortune. Like I always wanted to write, but I probably would have ended up writing State of the Nation, navel-gazing kind of sub-par Nick Hornby novels. You know what I mean?
But why did you say no when they tapped you on the shoulder?
No, I didn't say no. They didn't want me.
They didn't want you?
No. They, okay. They sort of said, do you want to try for MI5? But I didn't quite understand what they were suggesting. I was very green. And
would you have done it?
I didn't particularly want to do it, but it was very difficult to withdraw from those very early stages of the selection process, just because it's so intriguing. And you just, what I think it was Philby said, you don't turn down the opportunity to join an elite service. Not that he's a very good example for just to follow, but no, I can remember thinking I'm not the right animal for this. But now, having spent my working life, my adult life, thinking about these people and the world that they inhabit, I think I'd actually be quite good at it, but it's a bit late now.
And that's always probably a question you get asked quite a lot, to what extent there are real life spies still out there operating in the in the Lachlan Kite mould. I mean, are they out there?
For sure, yeah. I mean, usually now, more normally, it would be somebody like yourself who has a cover as a journalist, and so nobody suspects that by day you're doing this, and then by night you're running agents or handling secret material, getting it to somebody, and so forth. Because technology now is obviously so sophisticated and all-seeing that it's very difficult to arrive as a 25-year-old, 26-year-old MI6 recruit and have a long-lasting career, because they have your face, they have your eyes, they have your fingerprint. You can be found and discovered and seen by CCTV and all the rest of it. So you need to stick. The point being that in the old days you would have multiple identities, multiple passports. You go wherever you wanted, and someone, if they were suspicious of you, they would call up and say, Do you know this guy? And they say, yeah. He's worked for us for years selling Hoovers. Now you simply just can't do that because I wrote a book called Judas 62, which sort of illustrates this, that the older Kite goes into Dubai, but he has to go in as Lachlan Kite because he went there as Lachlan Kite before, and he can't, if he pretends to be somebody else, they'll just strip down his legend in 20 minutes.
So you can really only have one cover story?
Basically now, yeah. I mean, unless you're going to Peru or Iceland or somewhere that doesn't have particularly kind of all-seeing, sophisticated surveillance. But no, if you're coming into London or Moscow or Paris or New York or Tehran, forget it.
And given the advancing technology that we have today, some people argue, do you still need spies? Is it as simple as ultimately you just need a human being? Sometimes you need, as Bond would say, you need someone to pull the trigger sometimes.
Well, they don't. I mean, the MI6 officers don't. They're not assassins. They don't kill. They very rarely even sort of get in any kind of sort of physical danger. If that sort of thing needs to be considered, then they'll go to the SBS or the SAS or the Americans and so forth. So really, the business of an MI6 officer is to gather intelligence, to find somebody who has access to information that's of interest to the Five Eyes, and to recruit that person and get them to work for His Majesty. But you've seen with what's gone on with Hezbollah in the last few weeks. Hezbollah has obviously been hugely penetrated both by computer surveillance and satellite surveillance and all the rest of it, but also they have people within Hezbollah itself who are working for the Mossad. There's no way that they would have been able to do all the things they've done without having leaks within Hezbollah. So no, they're out there, and they're vital, because you can only get so much information out of one of these. If you really want to know what somebody's thinking and intending to do, you need to get as close to the seat of power as you can.
It's a really good point you made about what happened recently with Hezbollah and the walkie-talkies and the pages exploding. When you heard that, what was your reaction? Because it almost sounds like something out of a spy novel.
Yeah, well, it's an incredible operation, whatever you feel sort of morally or ethically about it. They obviously got into the supply chain of the pages and switched them out and knew when and where they were going to be distributed, and put in this technology that allowed them all to explode at the same time. I mean, it's an extraordinary act of imagination within the Mossad to sort of come up with that, and then to pull it off without being discovered was remarkable. So from the intelligence community, it's a round of applause, But whether the end game of it, the end is going to prove to justify the means, we shall see.
How high up do you think certain spies will have got over the decades? I mean, there were rumours years ago, for example, that Harold Wilson was a Soviet spy. Do you think anything like that is feasible? Do you think there will have been people who've risen to very high positions and never been discovered who were spies?
I mean, I think most things come out in the wash now. You find out what's true and what's not. I think that in that period that you're referring to, the sort of the 60s and the 70s, it was sort of every second officer at MI5 or MI6 was suspected of working for the Soviets or for somebody else, and vice versa. The Soviets believed for years that Philby was a triple, and I think that sort of level of paranoia has dissipated. Nevertheless, you are sometimes recruiting fairly kind of nefarious characters, so you don't necessarily know whether the person who has agreed to inform for you or do the things that you as an MI6 officer need them to do in order to get the information, whether you can fully trust them, and that's why they have the jobs that they have and they make the judgment that they do. But I mean, yes, you're going to get the odd MP who's taking the Chinese dollar. You're going to get the odd individual. Yeah, there's always going to be like a bad egg, I think. But I would be very surprised if there's a sort of cabinet level treachery in the last 30 years. But what do I know?
But you think it is feasible that even now in the House of Commons there might be someone who has been compromised?
Oh, for sure.
And you think that's quite likely, do you?
Well, it's happened already. There was somebody who was working in the Houses of Parliament who was...
There was, but I mean an elected representative.
Yeah, well, look,
maybe.
I don't know. But it's not... I mean, if the Times ran a story next week with that, I don't think everybody would go, good God. I mean, sort of anything's possible now, isn't it? And money, especially that amount of money, is always of great interest to certain types of people. But also the excitement and the drama and the status afforded to you by being a traitor. That's one of the reasons people do it, because it appeals to their ego, that they feel that they're in the double life is very thrilling, and you see it time and again with Burgess and McLean and Philby and Aldrich Ames and all these guys. So yeah, anything is possible. What I certainly think and believe is that there was, I don't know if they still exist, at least one source pretty high up in the Putin administration who was feeding very accurate intelligence to the Americans in the run up to the invasion, which is why they knew so much in advance. And I hope that person is still alive and safe.
It's interesting you mentioned Putin. Do you think that we overlook too much the fact that he was in the KGB, and that explains a lot of his psyche and approach to things?
Yeah, I think it's taken a long time for people to catch up to the fact that he's a maniac. You know, I mean, like a properly disgusting human being, straight up and down psychopath, as far as I'm concerned. And I think because he was the leader of a nuclear-armed state and presented in a reasonably kind of civilized way in the early years of his administration, people did give him the benefit of the doubt. They also wanted to work with him. They wanted to bring Russia in from the cold, so to speak. But something about the longevity of his reign, plus age, plus COVID, plus also just the massive psychological flaws in him, have led to this where he wants to sort of re-establish old Soviet borders, and he was humiliated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and particularly humiliated by the KGB not winning the Cold War, and has been sort of trying to get there ever since. But yeah, people were slow with Putin, and they kind of, in a way, they still are. You know, I think there's still that sort of sense of, well, if only, but it's over.
And just finally, what do you think explains the enduring appeal of the spy thriller?
I think primarily escapism, excitement. It takes you into a world that very few people have experience of. From a writer's point of view, the genre gives you psychological complexity, it gives you action, it gives you criminality, it gives you romance, it gives you sort of everything. It's a genre that kind of ticks all the boxes, and it's a broad church. So from one end you have Ludlum and Bourne, which is hugely exciting and page turning, or exciting to watch on screen, and then at the other end you have the great French series The Bureau, or you have Tinker Tailor, or these very sort of 3D chess, very psychological, very little action. So there's something for everyone, really. And it has a reputation for being male, but actually today, signing Kennedy 35, obviously 70% of people coming were women. Not just necessarily buying it for their husband.
Charles Cumming, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Spot on. Lovely.
It's all right.